Einstein, of course, wasn't the only person thinking about positivism in a scientific key. Mort Schlick was a fascinating philosopher-physicist. He had done his thesis with Max Planck, the great discoverer of the quantum. He was a follower of Ernst Mach, like Einstein and Adler. Schlick was somebody who followed closely the work of Poincaré and took seriously his ideas about the convenience of physical laws and how they could be adapted to make the world more understandable for us. And he closely pursued the work of Bertrand Russell, who had introduced a new and rigorous form of logic into the world. Like many of the philosophers of this period, the early 20th century, he was brought up with Kant, so to speak, although in this neo-Kantianism, he was also critical of aspects of what the great philosopher Kant had accomplished. Around Schlick, when he came back from a trip to Stanford, then returned, decided not to stay in the United States, but came back to Vienna, he became the center of a circle around the ideas of Ernst Mach, what eventually became known as the Vienna Circle. He was, in fact, the only member of the Vienna Circle with a regular philosophy position at the University of Vienna. The others were refugees from sociology, mathematics, from logic, from all sorts of other domains of science and social sciences. But Schlick was the one who had a firm grip in the philosophical center. Schlick took aspects of Kant's work to be absolutely crucial. Schlick accepted, as Kant had advocated, that mathematics was necessary for our grasp of the world. Schlick accepted, as Kant had advocated, that there had to be a unity of consciousness. We couldn't perceive the world into two thinking eyes because the object wouldn't be brought together in our perceptions. Schlick accepted that certain conservation principles, conservation of momentum, for example, had to be in the world such that we would be able to perceive things at all. But according to Schlick, Kant believed that what we had to have in us, what we had to be capable of before we came to any object at all, included Euclid, included Newton's physics, included that all points of mass were attracted to one another, included the idea that F equals ma, included the idea that objects in motion stay in motion. This adherence to classical physics, Schlick believed, was wrong as Kant advocated it. Schlick began early on accepting Einstein's view that there was a realistic way of interpreting physics that was necessary. Einstein's special relativity theory was not just a way of bringing together the different observables, it really was the way the world was constructed. And that idea was something that he stuck to, and it was an important point of deviation from Mach. Schlick was a realist in the sense of saying that physical laws spoke to the way the world was, not just to a useful way of organizing experiences. But Schlick also, as I just mentioned, disagreed with Kant, saw Kant's commitment to an a priori, toward the view that we had to have, in a certain sense, Euclid and Newton built into us in order to perceive the world. For Schlick, that was not possible. That Einstein had changed the role of geometry, accepting non-Euclidean geometry, where, as Schlick saw, Kant as having accepted it as necessary for the world to exist at all for us. And in these two ways, splitting from what Schlick saw as Kant's commitment to Euclid and Newton, splitting with Mach over the issue of realism in his perception and understanding of physical laws, Schlick was trying to fashion a new way forward in philosophy. He was trying to use Einstein as an opening up to a new world of philosophy that could deviate from Mach on the one side and Kant on the other. And through his following of Einstein, his assiduous, careful analysis of Einstein's special and general theory of relativity, Schlick hoped to create a new kind of philosophy, a philosophy of science worthy of the name. Otto Neurath, who lived from 1882 to 1945, was another founding member of the Vienna Circle. He was a strong advocate throughout his life for what he called the unified science movement, that all the sciences could be connected, maybe not all deduced from a single law, but connected the way the members of an orchestra would play together in a kind of connected harmony. He was an Austro-Marxist, that is to say, he believed in a material understanding of the world around him, but not as many of the German Marxists were interested in the idea of ideology or false consciousness, that people had different awareness of their situation than their real relations to power would indicate. No, he really was a kind of materialist engineer in his attitude towards the world. By training, he was a sociologist, an educator. He developed, along with Rudolf Carnap, the idea that all of our knowledge could be put into what they called protocol sentences, like smell, ozone, here, 12 o'clock. Simple, coordinating sentences that said what we experience, when we experience it, where we experience it, and connect those experiences with logical links. If this, then that. If this, then A or B. Those sort of simple logic connected to these statements of experience at a time and place. He developed a system of isotypes, all of those images that we see on street signs and in airplanes about, don't do this, do that, buckle your seatbelt, car could skid. Those sorts of signs were, in the beginning, Neurath's attempt to reduce communication to its fundamental elements. He was involved with urban planners. He set out big posters that he hoped would communicate the social and economic situation of the world to the great mass of people by reducing things to simple, iconic representations. He was one of the founders of the Encyclopedia of Unified Science, the series in which Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions first appeared. So, for example, in understanding the war, he would make a chart about the fate of soldiers in the War of 1914-1918 and represent by green soldiers those who had survived, by obviously disabled icons, the number proportional to those who had been injured on the German side and on the Allied side, and to those upside down, drawn in white figures underground to indicate those who had been killed. So at a glance, you saw the casualties. Or he would take the age distribution in Austria in 1923, men and women in each age group, and you could see the sudden reduction in the number of people in the ages that would have been born but were not because of the casualties of World War I. He had simple icons like worker, coal worker, as a combination of these elements. And these combinations of icons, like the combination of protocol sentences, allowed you to build up from simples into the more complex aspects of what needed to be understood. When he looked at something like a lamp, one of the things that infuriated him were designs that carried no relationship to their function. An electric lamp designed to look like a gas lamp, for example. He found repellent, a kind of metaphysics entering into the physicality of built objects. When he and his colleagues had a journal called Der Aufbau, the building up or construction of this new world after World War I, it was a photo montage, a little bit like the Hannah Höch image we looked at in the last lecture. He formed alliances with city planners who wanted to rid the city of the filth and darkness, who wanted to introduce simple geometrical light-transmitting forms, to design windows properly to allow the maximum of light and air to come through. It was a vision of a kind of aesthetic modernity based on engineering notions that penetrated into the reconstruction or building up, the construction of a new way of life. And that's what the Vienna Circle wanted all along. It was not just a reformation of communication, though it was that. It was not just a reformation of philosophy, though it was that. It was not just a reformation of the connection of the sciences, though it was that too. It was a change in sociology and education. It was a change in the living situation of the world that they were advocating. A hugely ambitious project. In this period, the Vienna Circle began to form alliances with a new group of architects who had, around the idea of the Bauhaus, this interdisciplinary collective of artists and architects and weavers and theater and music, they were attempting also, like this Vienna Circle, to reform the world, to make a new way of life after the catastrophic casualties of World War I, the destruction of the old. They didn't want reconstruction. They didn't want to build things as they were in 1913 or in the beginning of August 1914. They wanted a new world. Josef Frank, for example, was an Austrian architect who started to build, like the Bauhäusler, the members of the Bauhaus, in geometrical forms. Josef Frank was the brother of Philipp Frank, a mathematical physicist, also a founder of the Vienna Circle. And bit by bit, these two groups began to form alliances. The Vienna Circle standing for philosophy, technique, engineering. The architects and artists, at least the left wing of that group, trying to make a system of engineering and construction and a scientifically oriented vision of the world that would get away from what they considered to be the two metaphysical aspects of architecture and art. We then meet another founding member of the Vienna Circle, Rudolf Carnap, 1891 to 1970. He was originally trained as a physicist and a logician. The first work that he did was seen to be too philosophical by the physicists and too much physics for the philosophers. But he began to find a path between these two worlds. His most famous work was called The Logical Structure of the World, or the logical Aufbau of the world, the logical building up, the logical construction of the world, in 1928. He went on to publish works on the syntax of language, like Schlick, interested in the logical connection of things. When the Nazis took over, a philosopher at Chicago, Charles Morris, joined with Willard Van Quine from Harvard to bring Carnap to the United States in the mid-30s. Carnap's original work, perhaps his first really major work, was his thesis on space from 1922. And there he distinguished between formal space, intuitive space, and the physical concepts of space. Intuitive space was Kantian. What could be known about space based on who we are? What did we humans impose on the very possibility of experience in the world at all? Formal space was abstract, relational, mathematical. And physical space, well, what was given to us by experience. As he developed his thought in 1928 with the logical structure or construction of the world, Carnap introduced the work in a way that's really remarkable, and in fact, quite surprising the first time you read it. This is a very formal piece of analytic philosophy that builds up from the elementary bits of experience that I have into my construction of the other, and then eventually all the way up through psychology and sociology and everything that we know. But the beginning is nothing formal about his preface, and what Carnap says is this: we do not deceive ourselves about the fact that movements in metaphysical philosophy and religion, which are critical of such a scientific orientation as the one we're advancing, have again become very influential of late. Whence, then, our confidence in this new scientific orientation? It's because, Carnap says, we have an inner kinship between the attitude on which our philosophical work is founded and the intellectual attitude, especially in architecture. Now, that's really remarkable, that philosophers working at the boundary of philosophy and science could see their great allies not in the philosophical world at all, but in the work of architects. The Dessau Bauhaus, when you come to it through the countryside and the towns around it, arises almost, even today, like a kind of miracle. This sharp-edged, modern structure with clean lines and long corridors, this combination of simple color use and geometrical structure, it must have been absolutely astonishing to see in the 1920s, a kind of beacon of a new world, hated by some who saw it as destructive of German values, of traditional architecture, and fascinating, a kind of open portal to the future for those who worked in its walls. One of the chief shapers of the Dessau Bauhaus was the head of its architecture department, Ludwig Hilbersheimer. Hilbersheimer wanted to get away from the idea of a house as a kind of human face and imagine structures that were, in terms that would be used more today than then, post-humanist. It wasn't founded on the human body. It was reimagining cities in geometrical terms. Hilbersheimer was a Marxist. He had a kind of utopian vision of what society could be if you could only capture new forms of social relations in the material structure of the world that you made. And this view that you could build up from geometrical forms, from elementary bits of color relations, from formal structures into the complex things of life, was reflected in the way art was taught. Kandinsky, who could have his very mystical moments, would show people a scene, a still life, and then gradually break it down into its elementary geometrical components, into spheres and pyramids, cubes and rectangles. Carnap was invited to go to the Bauhaus, and in these geometrical halls addressed the audience of artists and playwrights and actors and weavers and light designers who were hoping to make art into something that was industrial, something mass-produced and open and radically different from anything that had come before. And Carnap said at the beginning of his speech, "I work in science and you in visible forms. The two are only different sides of a single life." It's that idea that there was a kind of joint way of life that the Bauhaus and the Vienna Circle were after that set up a kind of new vision of high modernism, that there would be nothing outside experience, at least for the left wing of the Bauhaus and the left wing of the Vienna Circle. There were certainly people who disagreed with that in both camps. But for the alliance that was created between these two sides, nothing outside experience, no forces, no idea of some kind of supernatural or metaphysical forces beyond relative motions, no psychology of the other besides experience, and no social objects like folk. But Carnap did want to say you could have, for instance, something like a class, something like a Marxist analysis, but nothing mystical like a folk, like a race. To that, he objected vehemently. Now, on the side of the philosophers was Ludwig Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein appeared to the Vienna Circle, to Otto Neurath, to Schlick, to Carnap, as somebody of enormous interest because of Wittgenstein's deeply penetrating thoughts about the relationship of logic and experience. But Wittgenstein saw much more distance between what he was doing and what the Vienna Circle was doing. In a way, he saw Carnap and the others as too scientistic, lying too close and too credulous towards their simplified view of the world. And Wittgenstein refused that and kept a certain gap between what he thought and the Vienna Circle. Nonetheless, to the rest of the world, they were often seen as connected. And Wittgenstein, like the Vienna Circle, was fascinated by architecture. In fact, Wittgenstein actually designed a house for his sister, who called what he created Hausgewordene Logik, logic become house. This idea, again, of geometrical structures combined to make something really quite stunning. In the Bauhaus itself, back in Dessau, not far from Berlin, Jucker and Wagenfeld took a lamp and made, in a way, a lamp the opposite of those ornate, too metaphysical lamps that were designed to look like the gaslights of old. Jucker and Wagenfeld create this combination, still sold today, of a cylinder in which the cord is visible and the hemispherical cover. It was harder to produce than they thought, and in fact required a certain amount of hand intervention. They had hoped that this would be mass-produced very easily, but it was tougher. So this alliance between the Aufbau and the Bauhaus in creating a new kind of high modernism had on the one side Carnap, Neurath, their ally in Berlin, Hans Reichenbach, and others who visited the Dessau Bauhaus at Hilbersheimer's request to interact with the artists and architects there. Neurath worked with architects and city planners. Carnap aimed his Aufbau, his greatest work, in large measure at architects and other moderns. Josef Frank, an architect, the brother of Philipp Frank, one of the founders of the Vienna Circle, lectured in the key series of public lectures that the Vienna Circle had organized. Wittgenstein went back and forth between architecture and philosophy. At a philosophical level, both the Vienna Circle and the Dessau Bauhaus were divided into right and left factions. In the Bauhaus, the left faction, led by Hilbersheimer. In the Vienna Circle, the left included Carnap, Neurath, Frank, and a few others. The right, led by Schlick, and sometimes in a loose way, Wittgenstein. It was the two left factions that formed an alliance around a sympathy with certain kinds of Austro-Marxism or materialism, faith in the power of materialism, of engineering and science, suspicion towards metaphysics, fascination with Einstein and the new world of science. Both lefts believed in the building up, this Aufbau, this construction of the scientific philosophy, this making of logic and experience, of observation statements. On the art and architecture side, the building up from elementary laws of geometry and color into the full world of complexity in which we lived. By building up from simple and basic blocks, both the philosophers of the Vienna Circle and the artist-architects of the Dessau Bauhaus were persuaded that they could rid themselves of metaphysics, meaningless propositions, or on the art side, decorative, functionless elements. But there's more. The Aufbau and the Bauhaus, these two sides of scientific philosophers and scientific artist-architects, legitimated each other. The philosopher-scientists of the Vienna Circle gained the imprimatur of modernity from their affiliation with the Bauhaus. That's what, in a way, Carnap is doing when he says, I don't expect this book to be understood by philosophers. I expect it to find reception among people like those at the Bauhaus. This was especially important given the Vienna Circle's exclusion from established philosophy departments, with the sole exception of Schlick. The artist-architects of the Bauhaus gained the imprimatur of the scientific through their affiliation with the Vienna Circle. As far as the artist-architects were concerned, the Vienna Circle were scientists. They were the harbingers of a new world of technology, science, and logic. Especially important given the Bauhäusler's exclusion from the established world of art and architecture. So these two somewhat marginalized groups faced each other and found in their mutual embrace a way to separate themselves from the traditional forms of their own disciplines, to form a kind of unphilosophical philosophy and an unartistic art. You could see the two as, in some ways, instantiated by the contrast between that phony gas lamp and the geometrical construction of the Bauhaus geometrical form.